Lieutenant Quanisha Epps claimed to work more than 1,600 hours of overtime, a staggering total uncovered last month by the New York Post. It allowed Epps to pull in more than $204,000 in overtime pay, on top of her base salary of around $164,000, plus fringe benefits.
Last week, her overtime salary of more than $400,000 a year, making headlines, prompting her, according to her attorney, to come forward. She worked under Madre as personnel officer in his previous post, but according to the complaint, the sexual harassment didn't begin until after he became chief of department.
What happened here seems to be that Lieutenant Epps is under investigation internally by the NYPD since October. And the allegations are that not only was she putting in for excessive overtime, but that she was actually putting in for overtime that she had not completed or done, so that she was effectively stealing time.
Today, federal agents searched the home of former NYPD Chief of Department Jeffrey Madre.
Yeah, that move is following his sudden resignation from the department amid accusations he demanded sexual favors in exchange for overtime pay with an employee, which he claims was consensual.
Okay, we got a major update in this overtime scandal story. It gets crazy. Happy New Year and welcome back to the channel. My name is Nate the Lawyer, and let's get into this crazy story about sex, lies, and overtime when it comes to the NYPD. All right, our story starts about 9 months ago when the NYPD was called out by the city council for spending massive amounts of overtime. Check it out.
The NYPD's overtime budget is soaring. It is up 50%. The department says that's because of frequent protests in New York City surrounding the conflict in Gaza. And it also is paying more to patrol the subways with the recent surge of high-profile crimes. The top brass today faced tough questions from members of the city council. Here's Eyewitness News reporter N.J. Burkett.
You get what you pay for.
NYPD Commander Edward Caban insisted today that the results speak for themselves.
Shooting incidents are down 16%, and murder has dropped 18.8%, while burglary has been reduced by 12.7%, and overall crime is down 1.6% citywide.
But in a hearing before the City Council, NYPD commanders admitted that costs are soaring. Police deployments in the subway system and details for demonstrations have blown the NYPD's overtime budget by more than $100 million, on course for an increase of 50% over their own projections. Council Speaker Adrienne Adams was firm.
The continued spending and significant excess of the budget on overtime only intensifies concerns about the department's management of its budget and workforce.
Now, as you can see in this photo, this is Chief Jeffrey Madre. He was one of the top brass there at the NYPD defending the department's overtime expenditure. So now after this occurred, the New York Post did an expose on the top earning overtime cops in the city. And one of those cops happened to work for Chief Madre. Check it out.
Lieutenant Quanisha Epps claimed to work more than 1,600 hours of overtime, a staggering total uncovered last month by the New York Post. It allowed Epps to pull in more than $204,000 in overtime pay, on top of her base salary of around $164,000, plus fringe benefits.
Now, Epps tried to retire, but then she was suspended without pay because the brass thought that she was stealing overtime. Then Epps had a new story to tell. She wasn't stealing overtime. She was getting paid for sex.
Lieutenant Epps says starting in June 2023, Madre engaged in efforts to coerce her into performing unwanted sexual favors in exchange for overtime opportunities. According to publicly available payroll data, Epps made a salary last year of over $164,000, but after overtime was factored in, she took home more than $400,000, making her the department's highest paid employee. After refusing his advances in October, she says, Madre retaliated by orchestrating an intentionally manipulated monthly overtime report, which resulted in a criminal and internal investigation opened against her.
Now, the chief responds to all this saying, hey, this was all a consensual relationship. She is just lying about him approving the overtime because he doesn't even approve overtime. And he resigned not because of these baseless allegations, it's because he was moving on with his career. Here is the chief. explaining it.
And I just wanted to come out and just stand up for myself and tell everyone that these accusations are not true.
Well, let's get into a little bit and ask about the one that is making the most headlines. Did you force sexual favors from a subordinate, NYPD Lieutenant Quanisha Epps, starting in June 2023? She's a ranking officer. Did you force that in exchange for overtime approval and other perks signed off by you?
Absolutely not.
What happened here?
Me and Lieutenant Epps, we worked together. Starting in early 2022. We were together, working together for about a year and a half, and we were working together. One thing led to another. We had an office fling, and that's all it was an office fling.
Consensual relationship, you're saying?
Absolutely consensual.
How long did that last?
We had got together a couple of times. There was really nothing to it. There was no romance. We weren't girlfriend and boyfriend. We had an office fling, and that's all it was.
You're the chief of department. Some may look at that and say it may have been consensual, but you had far-reaching powers and this was a subordinate. Do you think that was appropriate?
It wasn't appropriate for me to be in a relationship with anyone.
And so let me be clear. You're saying that you had a consensual relationship with Ms. Epps. And that she's essentially lying in this EEOC complaint. What do you think her motivation is to do this now?
Would you mind if I answered that? Because, what happened here seems to be that Lieutenant Epps is under investigation internally by the NYPD since October. And the allegations are that not only was she putting in for excessive overtime, but that she was actually putting in for overtime that she had not completed or done, so that she was effectively stealing time. So when she put in her retirement waivers, 2 days later, the NYPD suspended her. And they suspended her because of suspicion that she had committed a crime, which is stealing overtime from the NYPD.
It was abrupt.
Yes.
And some would say, well, if you didn't feel you did anything wrong, why did you leave so abruptly?
Well, there was a couple of things going on when I made the decision. I was already making a decision, and it was really weighing heavy on my mind. I was entering 35 years, almost completing 35 years of city service. I knew that I was going to have to fight, and I didn't want to have the constraints of the police department, being the chief of the department, holding me back from fighting properly for my innocence. When you're in the police department, I can't say certain things. I can't do certain things. I have to have the Chief Madre persona. When you talk about my work speaks for itself. Driving down crime as the chief of the department, all right? What I've done out there in the communities, what I've done in Brooklyn North, all right? I have given so much to the city, so much, and I've never asked anyone for anything in return, all right? Countless people who can never repay me for what I've done for them, all right? And I've never looked for repayment, not even from the lieutenant. So for her to try and spin a story like this is very hurtful, because I've given so much to the people of this city.
During our conversation and during a press conference today with select members of the media, the former chief and his lawyer claim they have evidence backing up their statements the relationship with Lieutenant Epps was consensual. And they say it includes intimate text messages and images.
So now you may say, well, this is a he said, she said. Quanisha Epps was banging them for overtime, so that's essentially prostitution, being paid with taxpayer dollars. It's all a mess, right? They both are horrible people. But that's not the end of the story, because some other women who work for the chief also were making monstrous amounts of overtime, like Detective Ingrid Sanders.
According to departmental records, Lieutenant Quanisha Epps, Madre's personnel officer, worked more than 1,600 hours in the fiscal year of 2024, bumping her salary to $406,000. It also shows Detective Ingrid Sanders, Madre's driver, with more than 1,400 hours of overtime, bumping her salary to $352,000. Madre's second in command, Deputy Chief Paul Saraceno, who oversaw overtime approval, was modified Wednesday evening. And Monday, Commissioner Jessica Tisch removed 14 officials from the Internal Affairs Bureau after the chief also abruptly resigned in the overtime abuse scandal.
Now, Quanisha Epps is making $400,000 a year. Ingrid is making $350,000 a year. Are there any other female officers working for the chief making monstrous amounts of overtime? Well, yes. Yes, there was. Here's Ada Reyes, she made $53,000 in overtime, New York Post reports. Now, overtime isn't something new in law enforcement. On average, NYPD officers can make between 10 to 20% of their salary in overtime. But now, if you compare that to the 3 women who are working for the chief, for instance, Quanisha Epps, her base salary is $164,000. So if you factor in overtime, she made 124% of her base salary in overtime. That's a lot more than the 10 to 20% on average. Ingrid Saunders, she made 84% of her estimated base salary in overtime. And Detective Reyes made 57% of her base salary in overtime. So this seemed to be a real problem. So with all these women being paid these huge amounts of overtime and all these questions about sex for public funds, the FBI and Internal Affairs said, hey, we gotta really look to see what's going on here, because we have hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars going to what looks to be a sex for pay scandal.
Hey, Teresa. So what we know right now is that federal agents and the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau raided Jeffrey Madre's home, which is right behind me, this morning. Now, NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch, in a statement, said other locations were searched as well, but didn't give specifics. Now, take a look at this video here. This is video of investigators bringing out boxes and bins of papers. Madre is being investigated over allegations that he demanded sex from a subordinate in exchange for overtime pay. A day before these bombshell allegations were made, Madre put in his retirement papers, leaving his position as chief of department. The new chief of department, John Schell, was sworn in on New Year's Eve, but Commissioner Tisch also making clear this morning that Madre has been suspended from the department as well. Any NYPD officer who retires technically stays on the books for 30 days and can be suspended if it's determined he's violated department rules or committed a criminal act. Madre has denied the accusations that he forced this lieutenant to have sex with him, claiming that the relationship was consensual. We have reached out to Madre's lawyers, but haven't heard back yet. Now, on Tuesday, Mayor Adams also said that Commissioner Tisch is doing a review of the department and looking specifically at how overtime hours are logged.
So now, what do you think? At first, I thought the chief and Quanisha Epps were bad people, but now it seems like the chief was doing this with a whole bunch of other people. Now, the allegations are specifically with Epps, not these other 2 officers who are not saying that they were harassed sexually. But my God, $350,000 in overtime? That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And it all happens to go to women who are on the police force who happens to work under this guy. None of this makes sense. And for those of you who watch the channel all the time, this is exactly what's going on in Dalton. This is exactly what Tiffany Hinyard was doing with the police department in Dalton. Remember?
The officers are paid every 2 weeks, which without overtime is 80 hours. But when they're put on Hinyard's detail, that 80 hours balloons to well over 100 hours, sometimes 200 hours. And in the case of Officer Terry Young last May, 303 hours worked over a 2-week period. That resulted in a single paycheck of more than $13,000.
How does a person put in a 2-week pay period, 303 hours? That's impossible. That's impossible.
336
Does he never go to sleep?
In fact, there are 336 hours total in 2 weeks, meaning Young was not being paid for only 33 hours over that period. Other officers on the security detail are also racking up overtime paychecks in the multiple thousands of dollars.
So as you see, for police officers, it seems like the easiest way for them to steal money from the public is just faking overtime. Hinyard did it. I'm surprised the FBI hasn't raided Hinyard and the police officers there for essentially doing the same thing that's happening in New York City with overtime. Because obviously that guy's not working every single hour of every single day for $13,000 in 1 week for Hinyard. And the same with these other officers, right? She's admitted, hey, she wasn't doing that work. She was banging the chief and getting $200,000 or $300,000 in overtime. But let me know what you feel about this story, because at first I was like, hey, Quanisha Epps, Epps maybe has some culpability here, which I still think she does because she knows she was getting paid to bang the chief. This is essentially prostitution. But the chief, I think, is the worst criminal of them all if these things are true, because his driver's making all this money, these other detectives making all this money, they all happen to be females. It all smells bad. So again, all people mentioned from Dalton to New York City are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And my opinion is they're all scum and they all need justice to be done. But that's my opinion. What's yours? Let me know in the comment section what you think. Tell me, hey, yo, Nate, you're wrong. This Chief Madre is a hero and you guys need to stop bad-mouthing him. I think he's a scumbag. But that's my opinion. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe to all that great YouTube stuff. If you reached this part of the video and you haven't subscribed yet, come on, really? You're killing me. My name is Nate the Lawyer. I'm out. Peace.